The last thing Pacu ever said to his older brother was this: "Not every war is fought with a weapon in your hand." Tosa Nakai had laughed at that. He had reached over and gripped the back of Pacu's neck the way older brothers do, rough and tender at the same time, and told him that was the kind of thing a man says before he gets himself killed. Pacu had smiled. He always smiled when Tosa Nakai said something that frightened him, as if the smile were a shield fashioned from good humor and stubbornness. That was in the autumn of 1841, 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days before the story we are about to tell. On a cold Tuesday in the middle of October, 1843, Tosa Nakai stood at the edge of a stand of post oak trees on the Red River frontier of the Republic of Texas and watched smoke rise from the chimneys of a plantation called Harrow's Reach. He had been watching for 4 nights. He had not slept more than 2 hours together in all that time. His lieutenant, a broad-shouldered warrior named Quasia, had stopped asking questions about what they were waiting for. He had simply stopped asking, which meant he had begun forming his own answers, and Tosa Nakai could feel those answers pressing against the back of every conversation like a second person waiting to speak. The plantation sat in a long, flat clearing that had been cut from the eastern Texas timber with the kind of brute thoroughness that left nothing graceful behind. There were fields, already harvested, gray and stripped in the October cold. There were outbuildings arranged in a line that Tosa Nakai had mapped in his memory without writing anything down. The main house at the northern end, white painted, 2 stories, the kind of house a man builds when he wants other men to understand what he has become. Then the overseer's quarters, then the cotton press building, then the smokehouse. Then, at the southern edge of the property, a row of 8 small structures, low, dark, set close to the ground, like something trying not to be seen. He had counted the people coming and going from those structures for 4 nights. He had counted children. He had counted old men and women who moved slowly, and a young man who moved quickly, and a woman who seemed to move always with purpose, always carrying something, always going somewhere. He did not know their names. He knew their patterns the way a man knows the behavior of the land around a water source. What he knew about Harrow, he had known for 2 years. Lemuel Harrow was 51 years old, originally from South Carolina, and had come to Texas in 1838 with capital enough to buy land and men both. He ran his plantation with the specific cruelty of a man who had elevated cruelty to a philosophy. He did not rage. He calculated. His overseers did not beat people because they were angry. They beat people because Harrow had determined that pain administered on a schedule was more efficient than pain administered in response to events. He had read this somewhere, or decided it himself. It did not matter which. The result was the same. Tosa Nakai knew all of this because a Comanche warrior does not raid blindly. He learns the land before he moves through it. But there was something else he knew, something that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with a grave that sat on a hillside above the Canadian River, where the prairie grass came up thick and yellow every spring, and a man who had never wanted anything but peace lay buried with a Comanche warrior's arrows and a white man's lie carved into the earth around him. Pacu had been traveling south in the autumn of 1841, moving along the Red River with 2 horses and a small amount of trade goods, doing the kind of slow, careful commerce that kept relationships alive between nations and peoples who did not always trust one another. He had no weapon beyond a skinning knife. He had a letter of introduction written in English by a Comanche-speaking trader named Marsh, identifying him as a peaceful merchant. On the night of the 23rd of October, 1841, a thunderstorm had driven Pacu to shelter at the edge of a property that would later be identified in the Republic of Texas court records as land belonging to a man named Harrow. The court records would further note that Pacu had been found sheltering 4 enslaved people who had run from the Harrow plantation during the confusion of the storm. The court records, filed by Harrow himself, described Pacu as a horse thief and an instigator of rebellion. They described the 4 enslaved people, whose names the records did not bother to include, as recovered property. They did not describe what happened to Pacu. That part of the record was blank, the way records are blank when the people who write them decide that certain truths do not need to be preserved. Tosa Nakai had learned the truth from a man named Cutter, a former Harrow overseer who had left Texas with a drinking problem and a conscience he could not quiet. Cutter had found a Comanche trader in a San Antonio cantina 18 months after the event. and told the story in exchange for enough whiskey to make him feel that he had balanced some account he could not name. He described Paku not as a horse thief, but as a man who had fed 4 frightened people in a rainstorm and refused, when Harrow's men arrived, to hand them over. He described what happened next in 22 words, and then he stopped talking and stared at the table, and the Comanche trader had sent those 22 words north to Tosa Nakai, word by careful word. Tosa Nakai had read them, not literally, for he did not read English, but through the translation of a man he trusted, and then he had folded that knowledge into a place inside himself where he kept the things he was not yet ready to act on. He had kept it there for almost 2 years. He had let it sit and grow precise. He had let himself understand, slowly, that burning Harrow's Reach to the ground and riding away would mean leaving the people in those low southern buildings to whatever came next, which would be worse than what they had now. Paku had said, "Not every war is fought with a weapon in your hand." Tosa Nakai was still working out what that meant. Before we continue, before we follow him into that stand of post oaks on the coldest night of October, 1843, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments what country and city you're watching from. Knowing where these stories reach matters more than you know. And if you're drawn to the histories that the books leave out, the ones that took place between people the world tried to make invisible, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we find another one. Now let me tell you what happened when Tosa Nakai finally stopped waiting. The woman's name was Dara. She had been born in the Futa Jalan Highlands of West Africa, in a village near the headwaters of a river, whose name she still said to herself some mornings before she was fully awake, as if keeping the sound of it alive in her mouth was a form of preservation. She had been taken when she was 19 years old, sold north to the coast, loaded onto a ship, sold again in New Orleans, transported to Texas by a factor who moved human beings across the landscape with the same administrative neutrality he applied to bales of cotton. She was now 34 years old, and she had been at Harrow's Reach for 9 years, long enough to know every inch of it, long enough to have become what the other enslaved people came to when things needed to be fixed. Bodies, disagreements, broken spirits, wounds that had no physical location. She had a son named Ekuban, who was 17 and constitutionally incapable of keeping his fury at a manageable temperature. This frightened her more than anything Harrow had ever done. Harrow's cruelty was external and therefore, in some terrible sense, navigable. Ekuban's anger was internal and directed at targets that could destroy him. She also had, since 3 weeks ago, something she had not had in all her 9 years at Harrow's Reach, a reason to believe that something was about to change. The reason was a Creek woman named Celia. Celia had arrived at Harrow's Reach in the first week of October, sold as part of a bulk purchase that Harrow had made from 3 failing plantations to the east. She was 30 years old, originally from Alabama, had been separated from her family during the forced removal of the Creek Nation along the Trail of Tears in 1836, had been captured and sold into bondage in the chaos that followed, and had spent the last 7 years moving between plantations as property while carrying in her head an education and a political intelligence that her captors had consistently failed to notice. She spoke English, Creek, fragments of Comanche, and enough Spanish to negotiate in border markets. She had survived by being underestimated. On her 4th night at Harrow's Reach, she had come to Dara's door after the 9 o'clock bell and told her, in a voice so quiet it was almost only breath, that there was a Comanche war party in the tree line to the west. Dara had looked at her for a long moment and said, "How many?" 15 that I counted. There may be more beyond the ridge. How do you know they're not here to raid? Because they've been there for 3 nights, Celia said. Raiders don't wait. Whatever they're waiting for, it's not livestock. This was the kind of thinking Dara recognized immediately, not as hope, which was something she had learned to treat with great caution, but as information. Information was different from hope. Information was something you could use. She had spent the next 2 days watching Harrow for the things she already suspected and now needed to confirm. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found it, in a conversation between Harrow and his factor, that she overheard through the wall of the smokehouse while pretending to carry wood, a wall that Harrow, for all his calculations, had never bothered to make thick. Harrow was planning to move the plantation. Not all of it. Himself, the house contents, the field equipment. He was moving south to a larger operation near the coast, and the people, all 91 of them, including the 30 families recently purchased, would be sold separately to maximize the return. Families divided, children separated, everything that had been built in terms of human relationships over years, dismantled for profit in a single transaction. He was planning to do it before Christmas, which meant they had, at most, 8 weeks. On the 5th night of Tosa Nakai's vigil, Celia walked to the tree line. This took a courage that does not have a simple name. To leave the plantation at night was already a crime under the laws of the Republic of Texas, punishable by whipping. To walk deliberately toward a Comanche war party in darkness, armed with nothing but language and intention, required a different category of nerve altogether. She went anyway. She went because she was the only one who could, because she spoke fragments of Comanche, and because she had a theory that a man who waited 4 nights in the cold without raiding had something other than destruction in mind. She was 30 yards into the trees before a shape that had been perfectly still became a person standing in front of her. She stopped. She said, in Comanche, the only formal greeting she knew, "I see you, and I come in peace." There was silence for a moment that stretched long enough to become painful. Then a voice said in English, "Your Comanche is very bad." Despite everything, she almost laughed. She said, "I know. I learned it from a trader who probably learned it wrong." Another silence. Then, "What do you want?" "I want to know why you're watching that plantation." "That is my question to ask." "Then ask it differently," Celia said. "Because we don't have time for the version where we both pretend we don't know what the other one needs." The shape in the darkness was quiet for a moment. Then it moved, and for the first time she could see Tosa Nakai clearly. A man in his late 40s, with a face that had been weathered by years, and something else she couldn't name immediately. Something heavier than weather, something that had taken up residence behind his eyes and built a permanent structure there. He said, "There is a man in that house who killed my brother." Celia held very still. She said, "Harrow." "Yes, and you came here to kill him." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I came here to decide." What happened in the next 4 nights was a negotiation conducted in fragments, in darkness, in the narrow grammar of people who shared almost no language and were trying to build trust out of necessity and something more fragile and more powerful, the recognition that they were looking at the same problem from opposite sides of a wall neither of them had built. The Texas night had a specific cold in late October, not the killing cold of the northern plains that Tosa Nakai's people moved through in winter, but a wet, penetrating cold that came up from the river bottoms and settled in the joints and made the darkness feel heavier than darkness elsewhere. The post oak trees held their dead leaves longer than other trees, brown and curled at the edges but refusing to fall, and in the wind they made a dry, whispered sound that was not quite like anything else. Tosa Nakai had grown accustomed to that sound over 4 nights. He had begun to hear beneath it the smaller sounds of the plantation, the movement of the overseer making his rounds, the occasional voice from the cabins, a child crying briefly and then going quiet, the specific creak of the smokehouse door when the wind came from the southeast. He had not slept well since leaving the Comancheria. Sleep, when it came, brought him Paku, not the dead version, not the version he had arrived at after Cutter's 22 words, but the living one, the one who smelled of wood smoke and horse, and had a habit of humming under his breath when he was thinking hard about something, the way some people drum their fingers. Tosa Nakai would wake from those dreams in the pre-dawn darkness of the Texas tree line, with his hands already reaching for a weapon that he had deliberately left in his saddlebag, and he would lie still in the leaves until his breathing returned to something that belonged to the living rather than the pursued. Tosa Nakai spoke English imperfectly but functionally, learned from traders and missionaries, and the specific education that survival on the Texas frontier provided to anyone who intended to stay alive. Celia translated where his English faltered, and offered Creek and fragments of Comanche where his English stopped entirely. And between the 3 languages they built a conversation that was less about words than about the weight behind them. He told her about Paku in a way that cost him something to say aloud, not the facts, which he had recited to himself so many times they had become polished and worn smooth, but the texture of his brother as a living person. The way Paku had always believed that the world contained more possibility than it currently showed. The way he had moved between peoples and nations, as if the boundaries that others treated as walls were for him more like suggestions. The way he had died for a decision that Tosa Nakai recognized now as the most Paku-like decision imaginable, refusing to hand over frightened people to men with weapons. She told him about Harrow's plan, about the 91 people, about 8 weeks, and the mathematics of separation. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "How many can walk? How many cannot?" She had not expected that question. It told her something important. She said, 7 elders who are slow, 3 women who are close to their time, 12 children under 5 years old. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is putting information into a structure that already exists inside him. He said, "The Red River is 30 miles north. Past the river is not Texas." "I know. 30 miles with children and elders in October." He paused. "We would need 3 nights. At least." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you trust me?" "I don't," she said, "but I trust the math. 91 people cannot disappear on their own. You have horses, and you know this land, and you have a reason that has nothing to do with us, which means if you help us, it's because you calculated that helping us is also what you want, and that's the most reliable kind of help there is." He looked at her for another long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a mind he could work with. He said, "There is something I need. In that smokehouse. This is the part of the story where everything becomes more complicated. Because what Tosa Nakai needed in the Harrow smokehouse was not food, not weapons, not any of the things that Celia or Dara had imagined. What he needed was a document, a specific piece of paper that had been described to him by the former overseer Cutter in the same conversation where he had learned about Paku's death. Cutter had described it as Harrow's insurance policy, a written record prepared by Harrow himself that documented in careful detail the names and transactions of 10 Republic of Texas officials who had accepted bribes from Harrow in exchange for protection from certain investigations. It had been prepared as leverage, to be used if those officials ever decided to look too closely at Harrow's operations. It was kept in a locked box in the smokehouse because Harrow trusted the smokehouse more than the house. The house could burn. The house had windows. The house had servants who moved through it at all hours. Dara knew the smokehouse. She had worked in it. She knew where the box was. When Celia told her about the document, she sat very still for a moment. And then she said, "He wants to use it to protect the people we take north. Make it impossible for the Republic to chase us without exposing themselves." Celia said, "That's what I think too." Dara said, "That's very smart." "Yes. It's also the most dangerous thing I've ever been asked to do in my life." "Yes," Celia said. "I know." There was a silence between them in the cold October darkness. Then Dara said, "When?" They planned for 2 more nights. Tosa Nakai sent 2 of his warriors south to scout the route to the Red River, marking water sources and identifying the 3 points where 30 miles of Texas terrain would be hardest to cross with elderly people and children and pregnant women, and the full dark weight of everything they were carrying that could not be seen. He was meticulous about it. He did not plan the way a man plans a raid. He planned the way his brother would have, thinking about every person, assigning them a shape in the journey, making sure the plan had room for what could go wrong. His lieutenant Quasia came to him on the 3rd night of planning and said, in a voice stripped of anything except directness, what Tosa Nakai had known was coming. The warriors did not ride 4 days from the Comancheria to carry old women across the Red River. "No," Tosa Nakai said. "They rode here because I asked them to. They rode because you told them there would be raiding. I told them there would be a fight. There is a difference between a fight and a rescue." They were sitting apart from the others, in a shallow depression behind a fallen post oak that had come down in some long-ago storm and been gradually consumed by the land around it, the bark gone silver and soft with rot. The fire they had allowed themselves, small, smokeless, built in a pit, the way you build a fire when you do not want it seen, gave enough light to see each other's faces, but not enough to read them with confidence. Quasia was a man of 42 who had been riding with Tosa Nakai since both of them were young enough that neither yet carried the weight they would eventually carry. He had followed Tosa Nakai into raids that should not have succeeded and had come out the other side with his confidence in his chief's judgment intact. But this was different from raids. This required a reordering of what they were here to do, and Kwasia's silence on the subject for the past 2 days had been the silence of a man who was building a case. Tosa Nakai looked at his lieutenant for a long time. Kwasia was not a cruel man. He was a warrior whose understanding of the world had been built from a specific set of experiences, and those experiences had not included Paku's particular way of seeing. This was not his fault. Tosa Nakai said, "My brother died for those people in that field, not those specific people, but people exactly like them. He fed them in a rainstorm, and he refused to give them up, and he died for it. I am going to bring those people across the Red River, and I am going to make sure that the man who killed my brother cannot follow them without destroying himself. And if any warrior here cannot ride 4 more days for that, he can return to the Comancheria tonight, and I will make no story about his leaving." Kwasia was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Harrow?" Tosa Nakai said, "Harrow will wish, for the rest of his life, that I had simply killed him." On a Thursday evening, the 26th of October, 1843, Dara broke into the Harrow smokehouse. She had done it, in her mind, 100 times before she did it with her hands. She had mapped every step: the loose board on the north wall that could be lifted if you knew exactly where to press, the layout of the interior in darkness, the location of the iron box on the second shelf from the floor behind the hanging hams, the specific sound the smokehouse door made when the wind came from the east versus the west, and how that sound might or might not be audible from the overseer's window. She went in at 10:30, when the overseer, a man named Gant, had been drinking since 7 and could be counted on to be asleep by 9. She was inside for less than 8 minutes. She came out with a folded oilskin packet that she tucked inside her dress against her skin, and she walked back to her cabin without running, because running was the thing that got people caught. And Dara had survived 9 years at Harrow's reach by understanding the difference between urgency and panic. She gave the packet to Celia, who gave it to a Comanche scout at the tree line before midnight. By the time Tosa Nakai opened it and understood its contents, Dara was asleep, or doing what she did when she needed her body to be still and her mind to keep working, which looked enough like sleep that no one watching would have known the difference. The following night, Ekuban almost destroyed everything. He had known for 2 days that something was being planned. His mother had not told him directly. She had learned in 17 years of raising him that telling Ekuban something was happening and that he needed to wait was like telling a fire to consider its options. But he had seen the signals that she thought she was hiding. The way she talked to Celia, the way she stopped sleeping properly, the way she looked at the tree line at dusk with an expression that was not fear. On Friday night, he went to the tree line himself. He was met not by Tosa Nakai, but by Kwasia, who was significantly less interested in conversation. There was a brief, physical altercation that ended with Ekuban on the ground and Kwasia's knee on his chest, and it was only the arrival of Tosa Nakai himself that prevented the situation from escalating into something that would have woken the overseer and ended everything before it began. Tosa Nakai looked at the young man on the ground, furious, unhurt, vibrating with the specific energy of a person who has been waiting for something to happen and has decided to make it happen himself, and recognized something in him that he had not expected to recognize. He told Kwasia to let him up. He sat with Ekuban in the darkness for nearly an hour. He spoke to him not as a child, but as a warrior, evaluating another warrior, which was the only form of respect Ekuban's temperament was currently capable of receiving. He told him that the mission had 3 parts: the document, which was already secured, the evacuation, which would begin tomorrow night, and the message, which Tosa Nakai would deliver personally to Harrow at a moment of his choosing. He told Ekuban that every part of this required the same thing: the ability to move without being seen until the moment when being seen was the entire point. He said, "Your anger is a weapon, but right now it is an unsheathed weapon swinging in every direction. Can you control it for 48 hours? Ekuban looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Who are you?" Tosa Nakai said, "I am the person your mother trusted when she didn't want to trust anyone." That landed somewhere deep in Ekuban, in a place that his anger couldn't quite reach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do?" "Tomorrow night, when I say move, you move. You take the youngest children and you walk. You do not run, and you do not stop for any reason until I tell you the river is ahead of you." Ekuban nodded. He looked at Tosa Nakai once more, trying to understand him, Dara would later say, the way young people try to understand someone who has done something they didn't think was possible. Then he went back inside. The night of Saturday, the 28th of October, 1843, began cold and cloudless. The moon was in its last quarter, giving enough light to move by, but not enough to be easily seen, and Tosa Nakai had planned for a night exactly like this one, had waited through 4 clear nights for a sky with this particular quality of darkness. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, which meant the overseers would be reluctant to leave the warmth of their quarters for any but the most urgent reasons. The wind was from the north, which meant the sounds of movement in the southern part of the property would not carry easily to the main house. Every variable that could be asked to cooperate was cooperating. Tosa Nakai had spent enough years moving across difficult terrain in difficult conditions to know that this meant nothing, that any plan that depended on circumstances continuing to cooperate was a plan waiting to fail. But he also knew that sometimes the land is with you. Sometimes the night opens like a hand. What are you feeling right now hearing this story unfold? Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think of Tosa Nakai, of Dara, of what they're building in that darkness. And if this story is moving you, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these buried histories deserve to be found. Now, back to that Saturday night, because what happened in the next 6 hours would be spoken of for a generation. Tosa Nakai's plan depended on 3 things happening in sequence. First, Celia would create a distraction at the north end of the property, near the main house, that would draw the overseer Gant and his assistant away from the cabins. Second, while Gant was occupied, Tosa Nakai's warriors would bring 22 horses to the southern edge of the property, not enough for everyone, but enough for the elderly, the pregnant women, and the smallest children. Third, Tosa Nakai himself would go to the main house, not to kill Harrow, to speak to him. This was the part of the plan that Quassia had argued against most strenuously. It was also the part that Tosa Nakai was most certain about. Celia's distraction was a fire. Not a large fire, a controlled fire in the hay barn, set in such a way that it would burn visibly without spreading immediately to the surrounding structures. She had calculated, from 9 years of watching similar situations at other plantations, that a barn fire at 11 o'clock at night would bring both overseers, at least 2 field hands who had no choice in the matter, and Harrow himself to the north end of the property within 5 minutes. This would leave the south end, the cabins, the tree line, functionally unguarded for somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. It was enough. It had to be enough. The fire began at 3 minutes past 11. Dara heard the bell and felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite prayer, something that occupied the exact space between those 2 things. She had spent the day moving through her normal routines with the careful precision of a performance, carrying water, attending to the woman 2 cabins down who was close to her time, checking on the elderly couple at the far end of the row who would need to be helped to the horses. She had done all of this while carrying in her body the knowledge that tonight was the night, and the knowledge had sat in her like a stone, heavy, specific, necessary. When the bell rang and she heard voices running north toward the barn, she stepped outside her cabin and said, in a voice calibrated to travel exactly as far as it needed to and no further, "It is time. Move now, quietly." What happened in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes need things to be dramatic. It was methodical. It was the result of 2 nights of planning and 9 years of knowing exactly who needed what kind of help and how to provide it. The elderly couple was helped to horses. The 3 women who were near their time were helped to horses. 12 children under 5 were placed with warriors who held them with a gentleness that Dara had not anticipated, and that made something release in her chest she didn't have a name for. The remaining 60-some people, adults, older children, people who could walk and were about to walk 30 miles in 3 nights, formed a line at the tree line that disappeared into the dark. Ekuban was at the front of the line with the youngest children, exactly where Tosa Nakai had placed him. He was walking, not running. His hands were steady. Later, Dara would try to explain to someone what it meant to watch her son walk into that darkness with that kind of controlled purpose, and she would find that she didn't have the language for it in any of the 3 languages she spoke. Tosa Nakai walked to the front door of the main house and knocked. This is the detail that people who heard the story afterward found hardest to believe. Not the fire, not the horses, not the 30 miles. That a Comanche war chief walked up to the front door of a Texas plantation house at 11 o'clock at night and knocked. Harrow came to the door himself, because his house servants had already run to the barn. He opened it holding a lantern and a pistol, and he found a man he did not immediately recognize standing on his porch in the October dark. Tosa Nakai said, "My name is Tosa Nakai. I am the brother of Paaku, whom your men killed in October of 1841. I have come to tell you something." Harrow raised the pistol. Tosa Nakai did not move. He said, "There are 14 warriors in the darkness behind me. If that pistol fires, they will interpret it as a signal, and nothing in this house will survive the night." He paused. "I did not come here to burn your house. I came to speak." There was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained within it a very large number of calculations on Harrow's part. Harrow lowered the pistol, slightly. Tosa Nakai said, "The people who were in your cabins are no longer there. They are walking north. By the time the sun rises, they will be 10 miles from this place. By Tuesday, they will be across the Red River, in territory that is not Texas and is not subject to your laws." Harrow said nothing. His face, in the lantern light, had gone a specific color that has no name, but that people who have seen it know immediately, the color of a man whose world is rearranging itself faster than he can track. "I know what you are preparing to think," Tosa Nakai said. "You are thinking about the Texas Rangers, about jurisdiction, about the fugitive," he said the English word carefully because he had practiced it, "slave law." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "This is a copy," he said. "The original is already traveling north with the people. The original is a document in your handwriting, naming 10 officials of this republic who have received payments from you in exchange for specific protections. I am told it describes those payments in considerable detail." Harrow's color changed again. "If you send men north," Tosa Nakai said, "that document reaches people in this republic who would find it very useful. If you send the Rangers, the document reaches the newspapers in New Orleans, which I am told find stories about corruption in Texas very interesting. If any of the people walking north tonight are harmed in any way, the document is copied and sent to every capital that Texas would like to be respected by." He folded the copy and placed it back in his coat. "Your brother was a thief," Harrow said. His voice was working hard at steadiness and not quite achieving it. "He was on my land. He was in a rainstorm," Tosa Nakai said, "feeding people who were frightened." He let that sit for a moment. He wanted Harrow to hear it, really hear it, not as accusation, but as simple fact, the simplest, plainest fact of the whole matter. A man in a rainstorm, feeding frightened people. That was the beginning and the end of what Paaku had done, and the beginning and the end of what this man had decided to call stealing. He looked at Harrow for a moment with the full weight of 2 years and 3 months and 11 days of a specific, precise grief. The grief was not hot anymore. It had not been hot for more than a year. It had cooled into something harder and more exact, the way metal cools into its final form. He had spent a long time being afraid of what he would do when he finally stood in front of this man. He had imagined it many times, and in those imaginings the ending was usually simple and bloody and left him emptier than before. But standing here, in the lamplight, with the sound of the barn fire still audible from the north, and the knowledge that somewhere south of him 91 people were moving through the dark toward the tree line, he felt something entirely different. He felt the weight of Paaku's absence, yes, but he also felt for the first time the particular freedom of a man who has found a better instrument than the one he arrived with. "You are not worth my brother's blood," he said, "so I am not going to give you the honor of dying for something. You are going to live. You are going to watch those fields empty. You are going to explain to your neighbors and your banker and your political friends what happened to your property, knowing that if you say one word about what is in that document, every person you told will have a reason to destroy you. That is what I came to say." He turned and walked off the porch and into the darkness. Harrow stood in his doorway for a long time. The barn was still burning. The fields were empty. The night was very quiet. He did not send for the Rangers that night. The journey north took 3 nights and 2 days, moving in the hours of darkness and sheltering in the densest timber the land provided during daylight. Tosa Nakai's warriors spread in a wide perimeter around the column, scouting ahead, watching the flanks, maintaining a silence that the children, remarkably, managed to mostly match, as if they could feel the seriousness of the air around them and had decided to rise to it. The first night went smoothly enough that Dara did not trust it. Smooth beginnings had taught her to watch for what they concealed. She walked near the back of the column where the slowest travelers were, keeping her pace to theirs, listening to the breathing of the elderly woman she had known for 7 years, and who was now walking 10 miles in the dark with no complaint, only the sound of her breath becoming a little more effortful as the hours passed. Her name was Tempe. She was 63 years old and had been sold 3 times before arriving at Harrow's reach. She walked with a stick she had cut herself before leaving the cabin, cutting it deliberately, with the focused attention of a woman who had decided that this walk was going to happen and that she was going to arrive at its end if it required everything she had. She did not ask how much further. She did not ask where they were going. She walked and breathed and walked. The second night brought rain, not heavy but steady and cold, the kind of rain that saturates everything slowly and makes the ground uncertain underfoot. 3 of the horses lost their footing in a creek crossing, and the resulting noise, hooves scraping stone, a warrior's sharp command, a child beginning to cry and being quickly hushed, froze the entire column for approximately 90 seconds while every person held their breath and listened to the darkness around them to determine whether the darkness was going to answer. It did not answer. The crossing resumed. The child was wrapped in a warrior's blanket and carried, dry enough for the remainder of the night, its small face visible above the blanket's edge, with an expression of complete bewilderment that Dara, passing close, found herself memorizing for no reason she could have explained. Tosa Nakai moved constantly during those 3 nights, never staying at any one point in the perimeter for long, checking the flanks, riding ahead to read the land, returning to count the column. He was doing something that was both tactical and not tactical, making sure that every person in that column, if they looked up, could see a warrior on horseback moving at the edges of their darkness, could see that the perimeter was held, could feel, in some way that required no shared language, that they were not alone in the Texas night. On the second night, one of the pregnant women went into labor in a stand of cedar trees 4 miles from the Red River. Dara delivered the baby in near total darkness, with Celia holding a covered lantern and a Comanche warrior standing 20 yards out in every direction to ensure no sound would travel beyond their circle. The baby arrived healthy and loud, and for approximately 30 seconds there was not enough darkness in all of Texas to muffle the sound of that child's voice, and every person in that cedar stand held their breath. And then the sound faded, and the night was quiet again, and Dara looked at the baby in her hands with an expression that Celia would describe, years later, as the face of a woman who had just been handed proof of something she had almost stopped believing. The baby was a girl. Her mother named her, in the darkness of that cedar stand, with a name that combined the Fula word for river with the English word for free. She was the first free person born in that company, and she was approximately 45 minutes old. They crossed the Red River before dawn on the morning of Tuesday, the 31st of October, 1843. The water was cold and chest-high in the middle, and the horses moved through it with the steady patience of animals that have been asked to do difficult things many times and have learned to trust the hands that guide them. The people who crossed on foot held the hands of the people beside them. The elderly couple held each other. Ekuban, who had walked at the front of the column for 3 nights without sleeping more than an hour, stood in the middle of the river until every person had crossed, then crossed last. The Red River in late October was the color of old iron in the pre-dawn darkness, running swift and cold enough that a person who had never been cold in quite that way before, cold not just on the skin, but deep in the chest, in the place where the body keeps its most basic inventory of itself, felt it as a kind of awakening. The children, who were old enough to feel it and too young to suppress their response, gasped and clutched tighter at the arms and shoulders of the people carrying them. The horses blew hard through their nostrils and kept moving. A woman in the middle of the river began to pray aloud, not loudly, but with a steady insistence that the water seemed to part around, that the darkness seemed to respect, in a language that Dara recognized as Wolof, the tongue of a nation so far away, it existed now only in the mouths of its displaced children. Dara did not know Wolof. But she knew prayer. She knew the cadence of a person speaking to whatever they believed was larger than themselves, and she let the sound of it carry her through the deepest part of the channel, where the current pulled at her skirt, and the cold reached up to her ribs, and the far bank was still a dark shape that might have been a dream. Tosa Nakai watched from the south bank until the last person reached the north side. Then he watched for another long time, for reasons that were not strategic. The river made a sound in the pre-dawn darkness that was not quite like any other sound, a continuous, unhurried sound that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with persistence. It had been making that sound for longer than anyone living could account for. It would be making it long after everyone currently listening to it was gone. Tosa Nakai found, unexpectedly, that this was a comfort, that the river did not care about Republic of Texas land laws or plantation cotton schedules or the careers of 10 corrupt officials or the plans of a man in a 2-story White House, that it moved north regardless, carrying whatever it was given, going wherever it was going with the same indifference to human arrangements that it had always maintained. 91 people had crossed it tonight, and the river had not noticed, and that was exactly right. He was thinking about Paku. He was thinking about what his brother had seen when he looked at frightened people in a rainstorm and decided that the right thing to do was feed them. He was thinking about the gap between what the world was and what his brother had always insisted it could be, and whether closing that gap, even by the smallest amount, even just for 91 people on one October night, counted as the thing Paku had died trying to do. He decided that it did. He crossed the river. Dara was waiting on the north bank. She had not gone far with the others. She had waited because she was the kind of person who closes every door she opens, who finishes what she begins, who does not walk away from a moment that requires witnessing. She looked at Tosa Nakai as he came out of the water. She said in English, "Your brother was a good man." Tosa Nakai stopped. He looked at her. He said, "You didn't know him." "No," she said, "but I know what he did, and I know what you did, and those things are the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face moved, not breaking, not quite, but shifting, the way stone shifts when water has been working on it for a long time and finally finds the right angle. He said, "He always said that not every war is fought with a weapon in your hand." Dara looked at him steadily. She said, "He was right." They stood on the north bank of the Red River in the cold morning of the last day of October, 1843, while behind them, 91 people, many of them hearing different birds, seeing different trees, breathing air that felt, in some way they were still working out, different from the air they had breathed for years, began the slow process of understanding that they had crossed something that was not just a river. What happened to them afterward is a longer story. Some of them traveled east toward free territories. Some of them found communities of formerly enslaved people in the Indian Territory, where Creek freedmen had established settlements after their own forced removal. Some of them stayed near the Red River, in the ambiguous borderlands where the Republic of Texas's authority frayed at the edges, and a person with enough caution and enough luck could sometimes, for a while, live as if freedom were real. None of their paths were simple. The world they entered north of the river was not a world that had been waiting for them with open arms. Freedom in 1843 was not a destination so much as a direction, and the walking required to move in that direction never fully stopped. Ekuban would find his way, in the years that followed, to a community in Ohio, where he would work as a carpenter and eventually teach reading to the children of other families who had made the same journey by different routes. He was not a patient man, generally, but he was patient in a schoolroom, patient with children who were learning slowly, patient with the specific difficulty of turning letters into words into meanings. His mother would say later that he learned patience in a cedar stand in Texas, listening to the first cries of a baby who had decided to arrive at the worst possible moment and the best possible one simultaneously. Dara herself would cross the Red River once more, in 1846, to guide another group north, one of several journeys she would make in the years before the war, carrying the same careful knowledge she had always carried, the healer's understanding of what people needed, and when and how. She would never return to Harrow's Reach, but she would carry the smell of it, cotton dust and red clay and wood smoke, somewhere in the back of her body until the end of her life, the way a person carries the memory of a place that shaped them even after they've left it entirely behind. Celia would live in the Indian Territory for many years, in a Creek freedmen's community, and would spend much of her adult life working as a translator and an advocate in the tangled jurisdictional territory between indigenous nations and American law, a space that required exactly the kind of political intelligence she had developed over years of surviving under conditions that had never been designed to let her survive. She spoke 4 languages in the service of people who had been made to disappear from the records, and she made sure that enough of them reappeared that the records had to be revised. Tosa Nakai returned to the Comanche with his warriors. Quazia, who had argued against every step of the plan and had then executed every step of it with precision and commitment, said nothing about this on the return journey, which was Quazia's way of indicating that he had changed his mind about something without wanting to discuss it directly. Tosa Nakai went, before the winter closed in, to the hillside above the Canadian River where Paku was buried. He sat there for a long time. The grass was yellow, and the sky above the plains was the deep, washed blue of late autumn, the kind of blue that exists in that latitude only in those weeks between summer's haze and winter's gray, a blue so clear it felt like a statement about the nature of distance. He could see for 30 miles in 3 directions. The land he could see was the land his people had moved across for generations, following the great herds, reading the seasons in the behavior of the animals and the color of the grass and the shape of the clouds. It was land that was, even then, being contested, surveyors moving west, settlers following, the slow, grinding pressure of a civilization that expanded by pretending that everything it wanted had always been empty. He had been watching that pressure his whole life. He was watching it still. And he had come home from Texas having done a thing that did not stop that pressure, that did not change the direction of any of those large, slow forces. He had brought 91 people across a river, and the world was still exactly what it had been. And Paku was still in the ground, and the prairie grass was still yellow, and the blue above him was still that same impossible, indifferent blue. He sat there for a long time. He told his brother, in the way that people tell things to the dead, not expecting response, but needing to say the thing aloud so that it exists somewhere outside the body, what had happened. He described the barn fire and the horses and the Red River and the baby born in the cedar stand. He described Dara standing on the north bank saying, "Your brother was a good man." He described Celia walking into the trees toward a war party she had no reason to trust, armed with nothing except the certainty that waiting was worse than moving. He described Ekuban standing in the middle of the river until every person had passed him, getting colder by the minute, refusing to move until the last one had crossed. He described the sound of that woman praying in Wolof in the middle of the dark water, a language neither of them had ever heard, and both of them would have recognized for what it was. He described the feeling, which he was still working out how to name, of having done a thing and then crossed a river and stood on the other side of it and understood, for the first time, what the thing actually was. He had ridden to Harrow's Reach, with vengeance in his chest. He had arrived there carrying his brother's death like a blade. He had sharpened that blade for 2 years, and 3 months, and 11 days, and when he had finally stood in front of the man responsible for his brother's death, he had put the blade away. Not because he lacked the will, not because he had lost his nerve, but because he had, in 4 nights of watching and 4 nights of planning, and 3 nights of moving 91 people through the Texas dark, understood something that Paku had always known, and that Tosa Nakai had always resisted, that the largest acts of courage are not the ones you aim at a single person's destruction, but the ones you aim at keeping something alive. What he had done with it, what had happened in the space between his arriving and his leaving, was something Paku would have recognized, something Paku had, in a sense, written for him before either of them knew there would ever be a need for it. Not every war is fought with a weapon in your hand. Lemuel Harrow sold Harrow's Reach in the spring of 1844 and moved to Galveston, where he attempted to re-establish himself as a cotton broker. He did not succeed at this. The document that Tosa Nakai carried north of the Red River was never made public, but it didn't need to be. The specific, quiet anxiety of men who have things to hide and do not know exactly who holds the key to their exposure is its own punishment, applied daily, requiring no additional action from anyone else. Harrow lived for 11 more years in a state of controlled dread, watching the mail, startling at knocks on his door, and unable to explain to anyone, including himself, precisely why the winter of 1843 had broken something in him that he could not repair. The overseer Gant, who had been drunk in his quarters while 91 people walked past the edge of his window and into the Texas night, left Harrow's employ in December of that year and drifted west, eventually crossing into Mexico, where he found work of a kind he was suited for and where no one asked him questions he would have preferred not to answer. He never spoke about Harrow's reach, but in the last years of his life, in a small town in the state of Coahuila, he developed a habit that the people around him found peculiar. He left water and bread on his windowsill each night before he slept. He couldn't have explained why, if asked. He just did it. Sometimes there are acts of incomplete conscience that arrive too late to matter and too early to stop. The records of the Republic of Texas contain no entry for what happened at Harrow's Reach in October of that year. 91 enslaved people do not appear in any ledger as escaped. No pursuit is documented. No ranger reports were filed. There is only a brief notation in a land registry that the property changed hands the following spring at below market value, the reason unspecified. History, when it does not want to remember something, is very good at not remembering it. But the people who crossed the Red River that Tuesday morning in the cold dark before dawn, they remembered. They carried it with them into every life they built afterward, into the communities they founded, and the children they raised, and the stories they told when the night was cold, and someone needed to be reminded that the world had, at least once, bent in a direction it was not supposed to bend. They remembered a war chief who came to a plantation, not with a torch, but with a document and a dead brother's words. They remembered a woman who broke into a smokehouse in the dark and walked back, without running. They remembered a Creek woman who walked into a stand of post oak trees toward a Comanche war party and said, "In terrible Comanche, I see you, and I come in peace." They remembered a baby born in a cedar stand with 45 minutes of life, and a name that put two languages together, because one language alone was not big enough for what she was. And they remembered the river, cold, chest high, dark, alive with the sound of people breathing and moving and holding each other, crossing from one side of something to the other, not knowing exactly what waited on the far bank but crossing anyway, the way people have always crossed, because whatever is behind them has already done its worst, and whatever is ahead of them is still, improbably, open. If this story has reached something inside you, if Tosa Nakai's grief and his brother's words and that cold river have settled somewhere they're going to stay, then you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we find another story that the records tried to bury. Stories of people who were made into property and refused to accept it. Stories of unexpected alliances, of intelligence and courage operating in conditions designed to make both impossible. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These voices waited a long time to be found. Help us make sure they don't have to wait anymore. The prairie grass on the hillside above the Canadian River came up thick and yellow every spring. Tosa Nakai visited when he could. He never spoke about what happened at Harrow's Reach to anyone who hadn't been there. But sometimes, when a younger warrior asked him what the greatest raid of his life had been, he would be quiet for a moment in that particular way of his, and then he would say that the greatest thing he had ever done, he had done without a weapon in his hand. He never explained what he meant. He didn't need to.